you so much for having me. My name is Briana Hagen, and I am a researcher over at the University of Guelph, and I am thrilled to be here to give you an update about what we've been doing, particularly around our project In the Know. So I'm going to talk about the development and the dissemination of In the Know, which is a mental health literacy training for Canadian agriculture. So I feel like I don't need to spend too much time telling you why this is going to be important and why mental health is important, but a really quick overview. Canadian farmers, we know, are essential to maintaining our physical health and economic health for all Canadians. And when farmers experience poor mental health, it can impact their physical health, their farm productivity, family life, animal health, and welfare. Compared to the general population and other occupations, farmers have an increased risk of suicide and poor mental health outcomes. So back in May 2019, the Canadian House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food released a report highlighting mental health as a priority for farmers in Canada. With this report, 10 recommendations were made to improve mental health within Canadian farming. 6 of these recommendations were related to mental health awareness, research, prevention, and intervention services that targeted farming populations in Canada. More specifically, the report talked about a gap in comprehensive research within Canadian farming communities. And really, there have been very few studies assessing farmer mental health, particularly over the last 15 years in Canada. So that's kind of where we started our journey here in creating In the Know eventually. So we started with a national survey of farmer mental health that went out in 2015, early 2016, and had about 1,100 farmers across Canada participate. And what we ended up finding was that 45% of farmers were classified as having high chronic stress. Almost 60% met the criteria for an anxiety classification. 35% met the classification of depression, and 40% of farmers that participated said that they wouldn't feel comfortable or they would feel uneasy about seeking professional help due to what other people might think. So we wanted to dig down a little deeper into that and look at why that was happening. What are the barriers and motivations for mental health help seeking among Canadian farmers? So to do that, we did a qualitative study. So here, semi-structured, in-depth qualitative interviews were conducted in 2018, early 2018, and when possible, these interviews were in person. We did a few over the phone if people lived over 200 kilometers away from our university in Guelph, and they were audio recorded, lasted about an hour, up to an hour and 15-20 minutes. These were transcribed, and then we did a qualitative thematic analysis on them. So a little bit of results of who took part in this. So there were 75 participants. They included 37 men and 37 women, and one person who chose not to fill out the demographic information. They ranged from 25 to 78 years of age. Their self-reported employment was mostly farmers, it's about 70%, agricultural industry staff, veterinarians, and agricultural government, academia, and journalism. 10 interviews ended up being conducted over the phone, and the remainder 65 took place in person. So there were 5 major themes here that were around the motivations and barriers to help seeking that I want to talk about before we get into how we created In the Know, because this really informed how that went. So those themes included the accessibility of resources, stigma, anonymity in seeking support, what we've dubbed farm credibility, which I will get into, and recommendations for implementing resources. So first, overall accessibility of mental health supports was a key theme that influenced help-seeking behaviors among our participating farmers. In this context, conversations about accessibility encompassed participants' perspectives on how hard it was for farmers to find and then use available mental health supports. Largely, participants felt that mental health supports were not accessible to them. People talked about having to chase mental health services for months, with one participant saying, "Mental health resources are difficult to find. They're not consistent, especially in rural spots. And when you're in a crisis and you're in a situation that you need help, I can't even imagine. You're not in a mindset to go navigating and try to find that information. Many participants emphasized that it was important to build awareness of mental health supports and mental health in general within the larger ag communities. Further, several participants expressed need for normalizing conversations about mental health and mental health services to encourage people from a young age to be honest and open and willing to access help. In doing so, this would promote the use of the supports. Within accessibility, there were 3 sub-themes that I want to just quickly touch on, with financial accessibility being the first one. So financial accessibility of mental health services was regularly discussed by many participants as an important barrier to help seeking. Even where mental health supports and services existed and people were aware of them, the participants described that it takes money, and when a farmer is in financial stress, they don't have the money to pay to go to a psychiatrist or a therapist. Participants also explained that there needed to be cost-effective ways of providing interventions to farmers, as they couldn't always afford to pay for those services. The next theme was around geographical accessibility. So participants here were less likely to access mental health supports if they were located outside of their rural area, requiring travel time and time being away from the farm. In many rural areas, participants said it could be a little harder or a big commitment to find local mental health supports and services, and that the further away from your farm you get, or from civilization, the harder that gets. One participant explained this time commitment by saying to drive to a mental health service in this case would have been to the closest urban center, which was an hour and a half each way. The next closest urban center was also an hour and a half each way. That's hard. Many participants also described that it was difficult to justify the decision to take time away to seek help for your mental health. When time is of the essence there, farmers don't often have a lot of time. Those extra hours that it would take to travel and seek mental health services were often not feasible to our participants and were needed to maintain the farm, with one participant noting, "I don't know how you could convince them, farmers, that they have time for it or to make time for it." Some participants mentioned that they would prefer more services closer to home, or having service providers that meet farmers where they're at, or be flexible to deliver services within farmers' day-to-day time frame. To ensure that farmers can access these services, other practical suggestions for making them more accessible included making them part of something that's already happening, such as a conference or a meeting if farmers are heading in that direction anyways. Incorporating more mental health resources into existing healthcare services in rural communities was thought to be another way of improving accessibility, so that farmers would be able to access everything they needed for their physical and mental health in one place. Gender was another accessibility issue. Participants described several gender-specific barriers to help seeking and accessing mental health supports. They emphasized that men and women often talked about and experienced mental health in different ways and consequently faced different kinds of barriers to help seeking. With one participant saying, "For women farmers, I find it, mental health, different. It's the way that we worry because we're different. The way we worry and the way we think about mental health are a lot different." A lot of participants also talked about how macho stuff is huge in farming, and there's a lot of older farmers, males, that probably wouldn't seek help because that's the guy thing to do. This stoicism, or a manner of hiding or bottling mental health struggles, particularly among male farmers, created major barriers to help seeking. Male participants were described as having to maintain traditional farming norms, and both male and female participants explained that male farmers are expected to be tough, stubborn, bullheaded old bastards, and that maybe we men do need it, mental health services, but I don't think that they would accept it. It was common for participants to describe that women would be more likely to do it, seek formal help for their mental health, than men. Participants explained that male farmers would talk to other farming friends about their mental health more readily than if they were calling someone they didn't know, some strange person on the other end of the phone, for mental health help. When describing help seeking from formal services, many female farmers described that if they were experiencing mental health illness, they would have gone ahead and called someone. "I don't know that my husband or male farmer would have done that. I think it's a guy thing." While males were described as having gendered barrier to help seeking in needing to be self-reliant, they were also described as having more readily available informal peer support than compared to female farmers. So for example, one female farmer described, men tend to get together as dairy farmers more often than women do because men are more involved in their farming committees and organizations. Whereas I think the wives, they just don't have that communication. The second theme I want to talk about is stigma. So many of our participants describe being frustrated with the perceived huge stigma attached to mental health in agriculture and the related stoicism of farmers that we touched on before. They talked about how farmers hold things in and often don't want to admit they have a problem or admit that they need help. These participants felt that there was a huge need to break that barrier because there's a lot of people that it affects. Stigma around mental health created barriers for people in terms of reaching out for help, accessing support, and talking about mental health in general. Most participants commented that most farmers would not seek support for their mental health because they don't want anyone to know and if they were struggling, and they didn't want to look bad in their family or their community. Others explain that farmers have been made aware that it's okay to ask for help, and they think that that's the biggest problem. A few participants indicated that over time they felt things were changing in their communities and that there was less stigma associated with mental health and that it's not as taboo anymore. However, others noted that we were gaining inches, but there was still miles to go, and changes don't take place in a day or a week, especially when those changes involved eroding old attitudes and depositing new ones. Many participants indicated that it was really important to continue having ongoing conversations to try to make mental illness more normal and show that most people are dealing with their own kinds of struggles and stresses. In turn, participants felt that these efforts would help to demystify the idea that everyone else around them was doing fine, ultimately reducing the stigma around mental health and helping to create environments where more people are confident in talking about their struggles and then seeking support. Our third theme, anonymity, many participants referred to a certain level of anonymity when seeking and accessing mental health supports, whether through counseling services or helplines that were anonymous and confidential. These participants preferred being able to talk to somebody that they didn't know. Preference for anonymity were also sometimes influenced by perceived stigma and judgment from others within their community. One participant explained, because if you're going to go and talk about your problems, you don't really want it to be talking about, it's a hard thing to do because you don't want to be sitting there talking to your problems with people that you're in the same circle with either. They need to have some distance. It's a tough thing. It's a really tough thing because you need to have enough distance that you can open up, but not so much distance that they have no clue. While anonymity in seeking supports was preferred among some of our participants, other participants expressed distrust or discomfort in opening up to people that they didn't know. These participants explained that you need someone on the farmer's level and that they're not going to be embarrassed to talk to. Someone that they trust, someone that they know will understand. There was a delicate balance there related to the preferences of anonymity in seeking support, that participants typically wanted to seek support from people and places they were familiar with and trusted. One industry representative described, we can direct them to mental health distress lines and things like that, but it wasn't something that they even felt comfortable with because it's a stranger, right? And so they felt more comfortable, just talking to us. Whether a person, participating farmer preferred a peer or the anonymity of a formal mental health support, most agreed that there had to be a level of trust in the mental health support for the farmer to accept or seek their help. And that leads us to our fourth theme of farm credibility. A mental health service or a mental health service provider and their knowledge around agriculture and the considerations that needed to be given to farmers in terms of specific challenges associated with seeking help for farmers in mental health was described as farm credibility among our participants. Farm credibility was fundamental for participants to perceive a mental health service or a provider as beneficial to them. Participants described a real disconnect between some of the service providers and the culture of farming. Participants commonly indicated that when there's an apparent lack of knowledge of agriculture and the realities of life on the farm, service providers are just completely discredited within the community. Further, it was important to most of our participants that mental health service providers can understand what you've been going through and can relate, because that's the one thing with farming. It's so different than most other aspects of life. Participants also discussed that mental health services and service providers had farm credibility, were the ones that made certain to take the lifestyle of farming into consideration when considering their mental health. Mental health services themselves also had to have farm credibility in order to be accessed or recommended to others by participants. This was described by some participants as making sure that the mental health service availability was flexible within the farmer's time frame. I mean, look at a dairy farmer. They can't do evening mental health meetings or morning meetings, so you have to be working around their time schedules. Participants commonly discussed a lack of agricultural knowledge or lack of farm credibility on the part of the service provider as a major barrier to accessing mental health supports. So having farm credibility was discussed as an important element for building trust with a service provider, and that this could help them, farmers, open up a little bit to somebody familiar with the farming industry, and having someone like that talking to them rather than having somebody outside of the industry. So all of these together led to this figure, or the theme of recommendations for implementing resources. So here, underlying the farmer identified facilitators for help seeking is that notion of farm credibility. Each green leaf represents a facilitator that needs to be considered through the lens of farm credibility in order to effectively address associated challenges, which are represented here in the gray circle around the facilitators. These help-seeking facilitators included financial support, gender-specific approaches, ongoing conversations to normalize mental health, awareness of mental health services, the proximity of the services, and integration with existing services. So the arrows moving outward from the facilitators through those challenges indicate how those facilitators can help address or circumvent the challenges to encourage help seeking among farmers. So the take-home messages here is that help seeking is dependent on accessibility, stigma, anonymity, and really importantly, farm credibility. That there were gender differences there, and that a framework can be used or to develop or adapt services to address those farmer-identified barriers and increase help seeking, which leads us to the In the Know program. So overwhelmingly, producers talked about that importance of farm credibility, having something that they can relate to. So that's how In the Know came to be. And what I really want to do is talk to you about how we developed In the Know and how we evaluated it and how we're making it available to farmers across the country. So in order to guide the development of this type of program, we turned to a stakeholder working group, which is pictured here at our first meeting, our research meeting. This group is made up of farmers across many commodities, veterinarians that work with farmers, government staff, industry representatives, mental health professionals, adult education experts, and of course the research team. So this group is responsible on an ongoing basis to help us as researchers guide our research questions, interpret the results from an agricultural lens, and then develop any intervention or dissemination plans. So in our first few meetings, we explored the results that I've shared with you here and focused on how to make or whether we need ag-specific approaches to mental health literacy. What does it look like? And this is what we came up with. So here you can see what we really needed to be able to do was build up a knowledge base. We didn't want to isolate an already isolated group, and that we needed to create something that was not too airy-fairy, as one of our members said. Examples needed to be reflective of everyday life in agriculture. And the mental health issues it was tackling also needed to be relevant to farming. And that's how we developed In the Know. So In the Know was developed as a 4-hour in-person small group lecture-based, discussion-based training, which was guided by our group. The topics were selected based on previous research, our results, and our group, so they were farmer identified. All of these sessions were delivered by a mental health professional who also had an in-depth knowledge of agriculture. All of the examples and all the discussion activities were farm-based. So once we had developed the program, we brought it back to that group, and then we piloted it with them and said, what do you think? What needs to change? What isn't just quite right? We had a lot of discussions around the content, the examples, the pace of the training, and what the goals of the training were. We revamped from there, and then we brought this evaluation to a broader audience. So the evaluation sessions took place across Ontario. We had 6 sessions and about 100 participants. And what we really wanted to know was whether In the Know would lead to improvement in participants' self-reported knowledge of mental health, their confidence in recognizing signs and symptoms of mental health struggles, confidence in speaking to others about mental health, and confidence in helping others with a mental health struggle across the immediate 3-month and 6-month follow-up. So 91 of the 97 participants completed the pre and post training questionnaires. And then we did a 3-month and a 6-month follow-up with an 80% response rate. Over half of our participants were female, and the majority of our participants were between 18 and 59 years of age, and farmers represented the largest proportion of employment among our participants. So I'd like to go over the results of that pilot for you. So here you'll see the self-reported level of general mental health knowledge at the 4 time points, so pre, post, 3-month, and 6-month. And there was a statistically significant increase in participants' self-reported general mental health knowledge between pre and post training. So what you want to see here is that the yellow bars continue to get smaller and the red and brown bars continue to get higher, which is what you see. This increase in knowledge remained significant at 3 and 6 months follow-up. The proportion of participants who were confident or very confident that they were able to recognize signs and symptoms also significantly increased, looking for those same patterns with the brown bars increasing, the red bars increasing, and yellow decreasing. This increase went from 29% to 68% between the pre and post training, and it remains significant at 3 and 6 months. Here, when we're looking at confidence if approach to speak about mental health with someone, shows that more than half of our participants indicated that they were comfortable talking about mental health before even taking this training. But this proportion still significantly increased to just about 75% post-training and remains significant at 3 months and 6 months. And then lastly, this figure illustrates participants' self-reported confidence in helping others with a mental health struggle. So here, the proportion of participants who reported being confident or very confident significantly improved from 12% pre-training to 36% post-training, and it remains significantly increased at 3 and 6 months. When you then include participants who felt moderately confident, this gap got even bigger. So approximately 40 participants who reported being moderately confident pre-training increased to 82% feeling moderately or more confident post-training. So some take-home messages here were that In the Know was shown to significantly increase participants' knowledge around mental health, confidence in recognizing mental health struggles, speaking to others about mental health, and being able to help others when they might experience some mental health struggle. Additionally, 100% of our participants said that they would recommend In the Know to other farmers, which we used as a proxy measure for farm credibility. So this is something that's really exciting for us. So moving forward, we want to make sure that we're continuing to raise awareness and build research capacity for farmer mental health, support improvement for farmers and people who work with farmers to increase their mental health literacy. And we want to continue advocating, right? So one of the exciting things is that now In the Know is available. We have offered it up to any provincial organizations that might want to get in touch with us and deliver In the Know training. We have a wonderful trainer who is willing to help train new trainers in your provinces. And we are hoping that everyone, all farmers across the country and folks who work with farmers will be able to take this training. So if you have any questions about that or anything that I talked about today, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can contact me on Twitter or by email, and I'd be happy to talk about it further. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Briana, for that important message, and it's really interesting to see the progress of the study and to where it ended up with something concrete. And of course, just a reminder to everyone, AgSafe is making that course available to participants of this Western Poultry Conference on March 31st and April 8th. It will be a Zoom course. The link is in the chat if you're interested in it. Space is limited, so do register early. And thank you to AgSafe for offering it to the poultry industry. Briana, as we were going on, there was a comment in chat, when it came to the study, maybe 75 for an in-person, in-depth interview seems like a limited number, but tell us a little bit about the reasoning behind that and why you may have felt that was a pretty solid number.
Yeah, thanks for that question. When we do qualitative work, it's a really in-depth, intensive process. And normally, when you do a quantitative survey, you do have much larger numbers like we did in our quantitative survey. But when you do a qualitative piece, what you really want is that depth. So when we're talking about mental health and particular mental health struggles, we wanted to talk to people about how they experienced them and what that meant for them. So we wanted to make sure we had many, many perspectives, but we also wanted to make sure that we weren't over surveying people. So once we ran into hearing similar stories again and again, and we'd hit kind of that point where no new information was coming out, we figured we probably had enough to pause and do our in-depth analysis and then go from there. So branch off from there and then do interviews again that really went into really nitty-gritty topics. So 75 is actually quite a large qualitative number, and we got folks across many, if not all, commodities in Ontario, and we're quite confident that we got great perspectives.
And that is important as well, that you had that initial voluntary mental health survey. And as I understand, the second national voluntary survey is underway. Maybe can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we're super excited. Our second iteration of that farmer mental health survey is now live. It's online, and we're hoping that we'll get a similar response so we can compare some trends over time. So, we would like to know, okay, 5 years ago when we did this survey the first time, here's where we were at. Where are we at now? How has COVID impacted that, if at all? I would guess that it has, but we don't know yet. So we really need that data to be able to help advocate for more resources for programs like In the Know, more access to services. I think COVID provided us a unique opportunity to explore teleservices that hadn't been widely available before. And now that the pandemic has been such a big factor, we can explore putting those in a more permanent way in these communities that need them the most. So I encourage everyone to go get I can share the link with the group. We have the survey in both English and French, so I can send both those links along.
Perfect. That would be great. I think it's voluntary, and the more participants, the better your research will be, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I should just mention as well and clarify, I said that there is a limited number of participants in this offering of In the Know through AgSafe. Limited per session, I meant. And so if there is more demand than the 2 sessions that are currently scheduled, more sessions will be scheduled. So just to clarify on that. And so Briana will put that link there as well. When we think about if we don't get sort of a handle on this and target it specifically, have you been doing any looking at farmer suicide rates? I mean, we heard a lot about that in India, but I mean, is it a growing problem here, even in Canada?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, yeah, we do hear a lot about farmers who have died by suicide. I think every farmer I've met has a story of someone they know, a family member, a friend, another farmer who has died by suicide. We don't have great data in Canada yet to be able to put solid numbers. And I could talk all day about how good the data is or what we might need to be able to do to have that data be the most reliable. But they do have data in the United States that shows farmers are at an increased risk of dying by suicide. And anecdotally, we know that farmers are dying by suicide here. in Canada as well. And yeah, lots of folks who die by suicide in other occupations or in general population, they tend to have experienced mental health struggles. So it's reasonable to say that when mental health struggles are up, the chance of dying by suicide is also up. So of course we want to be eliminating that, but we also want to work on building up resilience too. How can we increase resilience for farmers and people who work with farmers to be able to decrease just that instance of mental health struggle in the first place? So I think there's got to be a top down and a bottom up approach that meet each other there. So we're working on it from both ends.
That's a good point. And just a reminder, if you have a question for Briana about In the Know or this survey or the process of getting to In the Know, you can type it in the Q&A area and we'll ask that. But you talk about resilience skills. I mean, most people would say that farmers in general are a pretty resilient lot. Did you find that in your surveying or what did you learn about that whole resilience factor as you went along?
Yeah, so we did measure resilience using the Connor-Davidson resilience scale, which is a validated tool. And what we found was that farmers were actually significantly less resilient than the general population. And I think what that led us to explore more when we went into our qualitative research was that maybe there's a difference between resilience, the construct that you can measure and teach, and put your head down and plow on kind of attitude that we know a lot of farmers can get through, and they do what they need to do to get things done, and they always do. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily helping their resilience. Their resilience still might be getting, worn down, where they become more susceptible to things like anxiety and depression. So fortunately, resilience is something that we can increase. So that's why I think looking into making sure we have resources available to help increase resiliency for farmers would be a really good way to intervene for mental health struggle.
And that's kind of some of the tools that you do explore and In the Know too, isn't it? It's not just being able to sort of talk with someone, but it's being able to offer some positive things that they can do a little.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So In the Know focuses a lot on learning signs and symptoms, exploring how farmers experience some of these mental health struggles, but it also talks about supports that might be available, and how you can be supportive in a way that's safe and effective. And then, when it comes to a point where you feel like this is something that needs some intervention, how you approach that conversation with another person in a way that is comfortable and safe. And then also providing a resource list or providing information on where do you turn to next when someone says to you, you know what, yeah, you've asked me if I'm struggling. I'm telling you I am struggling. Now what? So In the Know helps provide the now what. What do you do from there?
Yeah, as farmers, we can, feel like we need to carry on, but there can be an inner toll. And I think, interestingly, could there also be a link to farm performance if the person is struggling mentally as well in farm practice?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there's actually a lot of emerging work right now coming out on production and mental health. So stay tuned for that. That is a relatively new area in Canada, but yes, there's definitely a link there that we're exploring. And, we're not doing, you can't imply causality from an epidemiologic study, but what you can look at is the association between production and mental health, and what can we do there to help on both sides.
And we did get one question in here about, that resiliency factor. Is there a little bit on resiliency, or is that covered through In the Know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we talk about that in the Know, in the second half of that, about resilience and self-care, how to build resiliency, and kind of explore it from a farming context, like what's feasible on the farm and living in a farming community to help increase.
And you've rolled it out. Participants have already been happening. Is it going to be something that can be nationwide? Are you getting pretty good uptake and interest in it?
Yes, it's a happy problem to have that we have been overwhelmed with interest. So we are
Happy, but it indicates that the size of the situation too.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So yes, we are now working through signing all these partnership agreements. Something we really felt passionate about was we wanted to make it no cost or extremely low cost to farmers to take this training. And we've been able to do that. So we've rolled out in Manitoba, there's been big uptake. Ontario is now rolled out province-wide. Nova Scotia is about to roll out next week. Alberta is going to have their first session next week. And we are working out our agreements right now with BC and Saskatchewan as well. We just got all the translated material. So now we have everything in French as well. So we'll be training up some French trainers so we can reach out to our colleagues in Quebec and other French communities across the country. So yes, the goal is make it national. So if anyone is interested or their industry or their association is interested, you can get a hold of me.
Yeah, and that is something probably you've even had perhaps some international interest in it as well, because I think farming is one of those things that happens around the world, and that means Farm Stress does too.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so then, are you carrying on with some of this research? Has one project led to another? What's sort of the future hold for even your involvement with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are doing continual monitoring of In the Know to make sure that, we did our pilot in Ontario. Does that still hold true for the other provinces? We want to make sure. So yeah, we are collecting data on these sessions as well to make sure that we don't need to make any tweaks and that we have the ability to make evidence-based tweaks on an ongoing basis. So that's kind of an ever ongoing project. And then with the new survey, we are going to have loads of work to do once that survey data comes in. And I am also doing a lot of work now looking at how mental health, what's the mental health impact of being a female farmer? So that's something that came up in our quantitative work and our qualitative work and continues to come up. So that's another thing we're diving into a little more deeply, as well as the impact of the climate crisis on farming in Canada and not the mental health impacts specifically. So how has that land change and weather change impacted farmer mental health?